Hi, I'm David. This is June. It's a beautiful day in San Diego. I'm a doctoral candidate at the University of California, San Diego. And this is a video I've thought about making for a while, but was a little bit hesitant to do it. And then I got up today and had some interesting intrapsychic experiences and thought, what the heck? Let's just speak what I think is some truth out in the world. And as always, this is going to be extemporaneous. I don't have a plan. But the topic for today is how American elite academia got taken over by a bunch of racists. And sweetie, I never thought that I would actually say those words. Um, I started my PhD in 2018. And I remember about 2017 having a conversation with my twin brother, Peter, who was telling me about some very concerning things that he saw around race at the universities in the United States. And he was basically doing on the basis of some reading that he did. And at the time, I was going to Florida International University to get my Master of Fine Arts degree. And I didn't realize at the time, but FIU is kind of an outlier when it comes to universities in the US, in that it's in the middle of Little Havana in Miami. And so it's heavily influenced by the Cuban American community, which is quite conservative. And so I didn't realize sort of that this was a university that was somewhat immunized from some of the things that were going on in more elite universities in the United States. And I started my PhD at UCSD, as I said, in 2018, and it was just a complete culture shock. And I'll get into it in a little bit. Uh, since I've been here, I've just witnessed things that it's very hard to make sense of. And what I've realized lately is there's a lot of brainwashing that's been going on here. And the reason why I can't make sense of it is because it doesn't make sense to a rational mind. It's there's a lot of group psychology, just general racial animus that disguises itself as social theory and as social justice, and you kind of have to see through that. Um, I'm probably going to swear a little bit today, which is unusual for me. But one way to kind of get through the bullshit is to have a little bit of liberty with your language, just because there's such strong taboos that have been built up around this stuff at the university. Um, so let's dive right in. The first exposure that I had to what I would call overt racism was in the theory courses in the anthropology department. And we read theorists that made the explicit claim that there were different forms of human consciousness um, that were qualitatively distinct one from another, and that could be assigned racial labels, um, which is an evidence-free assertion, and it's a recapitulation of sort of early 19th century um, scientific racism. So now that I'm talking, I think I need to go back and start off with talking about race and what we know about it and what we don't know about it, and then I can get into the racism. So let's talk about race as biology. The short answer is that race is not biologically meaningful. Human beings comprise one species, um, and there are a variety of differences between and across groups of human beings. These differences occur um, in myriad dimensions: um, genetic, developmental, hormonal, morphological, you name it. And that these dimensions don't map easily onto each other, which is to say that they're non-concordant. That's kind of the fancy term for it. So, for example, skin color is probably the morphological characteristic that's most heavily associated with race. Generally speaking, individuals who are born closer to the equator have more melanin in their skin than individuals who are born farther from the equator. And the variation in melanin concentration in the skin is a result of human adaptation to the benefits and drawbacks of sunlight. And we need sunlight in order to produce vitamin D. We need sunlight in order to have strong bones, and we need it to reproduce effectively. But obviously, if you get too much sunlight, that exposes you to skin cancer. It can actually cause very serious acute burns, which can then get infected. And so human beings have adapted over time to try to have an optimum amount of um, skin pigmentation in order to increase fitness. Uh, but it's, as with all dimensions of human difference, the variation is not uniform. So, for example, you can have Inuits in Alaska that actually have quite dark skin, and the reason why is because they get a lot of seafood. At least historically, they've eaten a lot of seafood, and that provides um, what the sun has provided for other people, and so they don't need to have light skin, right, to get the nutrients. They eat enough fish. Another difference that's pretty common is that people closer to the equator tend to be more ectomorphic. They tend to be very much thinner. There's two reasons for that. One is it reduces um, the exposure to the sun, right? Because the sun's generally overhead, and if you're ectomorphic, there's just less of the sun to hit your body. And then the second reason is that it allows individuals um, to radiate heat more effectively because their surface area to volume ratio is higher. So people tend to be more ectomorphic closer to the equator, more endomorphic farther away from the equator. But again, there's exceptions to this. If you look at the Aymara Indians of Bolivia, they tend to be quite endomorphic, and that's because they're high up on the plateau in the Altiplano in Bolivia, and it's pretty cold up there. And so conserving heat is more important for producing optimal fitness. And then in addition, because it's so high, they have barrel chests so that they can bring in more oxygen, and that makes them more endomorphic as well. And if you can take a look at all these sorts of things, anything from tolerance to lactose to sickle cell anemia, um, these are all these are all increased fitness in particular environments. And so then you might be tempted to say, okay, well, human morphology in a particular locale is simply a function of increased fitness in relation to particular environments. But then, of course, you have migration, which means that people who are, let's say, adapted for a particular environment travel into a completely different environment. And then you have that migration into and produces the preconditions for reproduction between people from very different backgrounds. And none of these differences produced either through sort of a straightforward adaptation to an environment or through a combination of adaptation to environments in conjunction with migration and intermarrying between people of different ethnic groups or different ancestral backgrounds maps onto race as a set of discrete categories. So the short answer to is race in any way biologically meaningful is no. Okay. At the university, that truth is relatively well accepted. But there is another theory, and it's an insidious theory, and it's an equally false theory, which has taken hold. And that theory is that human beings may not exist as a set of discrete biological subspecies, but nevertheless, you can categorize human consciousnesses into discrete categories and then give these categories racial labels. And so a proposition that would follow from that larger proposition would be, for example, that there is something qualitatively distinct about white consciousness that separates it from black consciousness. And so the fiction that human beings are composed of biological subspecies has been abandoned, but in its place has been substituted the equally fictitious proposition that human beings are composed of a de facto set of consciousness subspecies. And that's the lie that has been spread at the university. It's the lie that's underneath a lot of action and policy and teaching and theory at the university. And within returning to the theory classes here in the anthropology department, I was given readings which made this claim explicit. I was given a reading in one of my classes which from an author named Sarah Ahmed, who made the claim that there was such a thing as a white world and a non-white world. And that whiteness was a bad habit. So she was taking this extraordinarily reductive view of consciousness and essentially claiming that there were two forms of consciousness. There was a white consciousness and there was a non-white consciousness. There's no empirical evidence for that. None. If you were to try to determine if humans had consciousnesses that could be meaningfully assorted into different categories, the thing that you would do is you would go out and ask human beings a bunch of questions about themselves, about their perceptions. You would ask consciousnesses about their own consciousness, which is kind of the only way we have of sort of assessing consciousness, other than some things like MRIs, which have their own limitations and I don't think would lend themselves to any kind of results that would likewise be meaningfully interpreted according to a set of discrete categories. But let's say you were trying to look at this thing from a self-report perspective, and you went and you asked a bunch of consciousnesses questions about their own consciousness. Things like, well, you'd start off by saying, do you identify as a particular race? Right? Most consciousnesses would make an identification of some sort to a particular label, black, white, Asian, right, etc. But then you'd have to go on, you'd have to say, well, does this actually meaningfully predict anything else? Does this identification meaningfully predict anything else? And you could ask them about political party, and you could see that there's a correlation at a population level between certain identifications. But that's always changing, and it's not an absolute predictor, and it's not a reliable predictor at the individual level. And you could ask about all kinds of other dimensions, right? Perceptions about morality, perceptions about belief. And then you would try to take a look at all these answers and see if they assorted together, right? And what you would find is that you'd find some patterns and you'd find some exceptions to patterns, like you always do. And that's the job of social science, is to describe the patterns and the exceptions to patterns, but you wouldn't find a set of discrete categories. And that is the racist lie, right? Is that these categories are in some ways referring to subspecies, right? That are distinguished either by biological traits or consciousness traits. And from the beginning, I've been able to make this critique, and it's worth saying that all of these papers, at least all the ones that I've looked at, that are making a de facto argument for different consciousness subspecies of human beings, are not referring to this sort of data that would actually substantiate that sort of assertion. They're referring to armchair philosophers who cite other armchair philosophers. So it's an entirely circular reasoning that kind of builds this up, and it's non-empirical. And I could make that critique from the beginning, but the question that I had is why are people saying these things, right? And I kept thinking, well, maybe they just don't understand the science. Maybe they're just not good enough scientists, right? Maybe they just need to have better arguments. And I no longer think that's the case. I think that there are maybe some people that are fooled by the magic show. I mean, race is a magic show, right? The idea of race as a set of discrete categories is a magic show. Race has impacts. Racialization has impacts. It's connected to materiality. That materiality then impacts the discourse of race. The legacy of slavery has lasting impacts, but race as a set of discrete categories of human beings is an illusion. So if you were a social scientist trying to describe a magic show, you take the illusion as real, and you take the impacts of the illusion as real, and you track its impact on the audience, but you don't treat the illusion as if the immediate prestation of the illusion was in fact true. You don't write about a magic show where a woman appears to be cut in half as if the woman were in fact cut in half. You talk about the illusion of the woman being cut in half, and then you talk about the effects of that. If you're going to do a scientific exploration of race, you have to talk about race as something that is in some way illusory, that presents for human consciousnesses the illusion that human beings can be meaningfully assorted into separate categories on the basis of objective criteria, either the biological or the phenomenological, right? That which refers to consciousness, but that's an illusion, and that it then goes on to have real effects. Which isn't to say that racism isn't real. It isn't. That's not what I'm saying at all. I'm saying that the illusion that human beings exist in just discrete categories is an illusion. So as I said, she's starting to. He's a sweetie. I went around thinking that the problem was one of ignorance. That the reason why these people were saying these things which were unempirical and false was because they were somehow being taken in. And that is true. Racists sort of spin out their own lies and then become duped by their own illusions. That's always been the case. But it's also always the case that racism is motivated by actual racial animus. And that's increasingly what I think is the case here. There are a group of people at the university who have a deep-seated animus towards people who have light skin and who are racialized as white and who are gendered as male. And they found a way to make a pretty good living being racists. Like, that's what's happened. And these folks are in total denial of their own racism. That's the deep secret within their own psyche, the deep flaw within their own psyche that they can't handle. And so, like all folks who are narcissistic and in denial of their deep flaw, they project that flaw onto other people. And so for them, everyone's a racist, except for the people that are exactly like them. So there's a deep-seated racial animus among many people at the university that takes the form of clearly false social theory, which includes massive psychological projection on the part of the people who have racial animus onto people that legitimately do not. And they perpetrate this racism with a lot of threats of reputation destruction against anybody who stands up against them. So, for example, in my own department, the anthropology department, there was a job hire that didn't go through, but that was attempted, where race, color, and ethnicity were set out as explicit criteria of job recruitment and selection. And so there is underneath the perpetration of the racism at the university always the implied threat to tar as racist anybody who opposes it. And again, that's part of the psychological projection, but it's also a purely pragmatic way of trying to perpetrate the racism and spread it throughout the institution. And I said at the beginning that racism, that the University of California and elite academia in the United States had in meaningful ways been taken over by racists. That sounds like a pretty strong claim, but it's the truth. I've been here for 7 years. It's absolutely the truth. There's a program called the Advancing Faculty Diversity Initiative that's put on by the University of California Office of the President. And this program incriminates itself in its own public-facing documents. The documents clearly set out a set of job hiring categories. These advancing faculty diversity hires, wherein individual applicants are racialized according to a set of categories. Some of those categories are construed as laudable and desirable. And those would be Black, Hispanic, or Latinx, Native American. And certain racial categories are construed as undesirable, white and Asian. And within each of these hires at the different universities, the racial demographic changes are tracked within and across hires. And those which create increased, what's called underrepresented minority representation, URM, are held up as exemplars of how to run a hire. And the specific instruments of selection within these hires are noted and tracked by the program so that they can be used in the future. Um, and all of this is supported with a $10 million budget. So explicit discrimination on race is something which is given to the University of California Office of the President by the individual UCs in exchange for earmarked funds. And the UCOP explicitly tells the schools how to do this. And I'm not going to get too far into it because there's going to be it's under investigation by the Department of Justice. They're going to detail it in full. But it's a vast conspiracy funded with a $10 million plus budget to violate the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the California Fair Employment and Housing Act, the University of California Constitution, and the university's own policy. And it's hiding in plain sight. Everybody knows it. The fact that there's discrimination, widespread discrimination on race across hires at the university is an open secret. Everybody knows it. Everybody knows that. And there are some people, I think, who are just completely ignorant about civil rights laws. I've run into these folks. It's amazing that these people actually have jobs. They're so ignorant about history and about the law. I can't believe these people are allowed to teach classes, but they're here. So there's some people that are just ignorant. There's some people that are in complete denial about it. Because to not be in denial would be to admit their own complicity in the racist system. And then there are people, and I've run into these folks too, that just believe that they're justified in breaking the law. So coming back to what happened here at the UCSD Department of Anthropology, I'm not talking behind anybody's back. I wrote professional letters to all the anthropologists in the department who were here at the time that the hire was made and said, I think you broke the law. I think what you did was racist and I object. So I'm not telling you anything I didn't tell them. I've been open on this. I whistleblowed on it. I've been opposed to it from the beginning. No, sweetie. And I've talked with these professors about why they did it. And what I've gotten was ignorance, extraordinary ignorance, or at least feigned ignorance. I'm not sure whether it's actual ignorance or whether it's feigned ignorance, denial, and then just total lack of contrition. I don't care whether it's illegal or not. We were going to do what we wanted to do. We needed to do this, which is pretty remarkable. These folks sort of, clutch their pearls over authoritarianism on the right and then engage in the most naked form of authoritarianism imaginable in their own department. It's absolutely rich. I'm a little upset about it, if you didn't tell. So how did this happen? How did this giant institution, the University of California, the biggest public university in the United States, get taken over by a bunch of racists, such that racism is in hiring? It's in housing for graduate students here at UCSD. There's these things called living and learning communities that are putatively, non-racist and don't select according to race, but clearly are, and allow people who are taken into these communities, each of which have a racial or ethnic descriptor associated with them, to bypass a quite long wait list. So you have racial discrimination in hiring. You've got it in housing. I've seen it in the provision of healthcare, believe it or not. It happened to me. It's in grants. President's postdoctoral fellowship gave explicit racial and ethnic criteria. That's also an investigation by the DOJ. And then you have absolute, totally worthless, unempirical junk science that presumes that human beings, on the basis of objective criteria pertaining to consciousness, can be assorted into discrete categories, which they clearly cannot. What motivates this? It's just racial animus, man. It's not complicated. Like, I've thrown out a bunch of fancy words because I feel like I got to address the fancy words that I've taken in here, with a bunch of fancy words of my own, but it's not complicated. They're just people here that are fucking racist. Just don't like people with white skin. Just like there are people that don't like people with black skin, man. Like, it's not complicated. Every racist, most racists, there are some racists that are just nakedly racist and they don't apologize for it. But a lot of racists don't like being called racist. They don't want to think that they're racist. So they come up with a bunch of fancy excuses to justify their racism. And they phrase their racism in a bunch of language that they associate with rectitude and morality and with intellectualism. It was this way in the 19th century. All of the anti-black racists had a bunch of fancy academic language to justify um, their claims that the human species was in fact a set of subspecies, and that you could rank order them in terms of sort of which species were more atavistic and which species were more morally laudable. You got the same thing now. You got a bunch of people with high IQs who have a lot of racial animus, who have found a way to do racism professionally, and who come up with a bunch of fancy language to spew their total bullshit. And it's time for people to start calling it out. It's time for people to stop being afraid of it and afraid of them, and say, we're not going to put up with the racism anymore. And that's what I'm doing. So to you people over in a lot of this is happening. I'm going to call out some specific disciplines. It's happening in ethnic studies. It's happening in the far left version of anthropology and a lot of anthropology. It's happening in far left places in sociology and psychology. It's gone everywhere, but it's been started off with the anti-positivists, and now it's just spread like a wildfire to disciplines that used to be positivistic and used to be empirical and used to be relatively reliable. And like a lot of evil, ridiculous bullshit, it started off by identifying some things that were true, which is that we had a problem with not enough, not having enough people from disadvantaged backgrounds at the university. Absolutely true. It started off by recognizing that we're not, the set of research questions weren't sufficiently broad, and we weren't looking at the full range of human experience. Also true. Right? And also recognizing that people operating in positivist disciplines have behaved in a way that were abusive and justified blatantly unethical and immoral shit on the basis that they were being scientific, like the Tuskegee study. Like, it started off with making some absolutely true critiques. And then these folks with racial animus use that as an entryway to get in and start spreading their bullshit. So what needs to happen? Well, what needs to happen is the people that aren't racist, the people that don't have racial animus, need to push back at all levels against this. We need to push back against the unempiricism. We need to push back against the evidence-free claims. We need to push back against the armchair philosophizing that masks as science. We need to push back against the constant racialization of everybody at all times, everywhere, pretending that somehow race is the most important thing about people. We need to call out the Ibram X. Kendis and the Robin DiAngelos for the psychotic manipulators that they are, and also the terrible writers that they are. We need to stop pretending that abstruse prose that's totally impenetrable is just that. It's just abstruse prose that's totally impenetrable. It's not representing some great wisdom that the majority of us have been hidden, that has been hidden from us, and now is being revealed to us in this hyper theoretical language that helps us get to the bottom of everything. We need to just call it out for what it is, which is just a bunch of nonsense. And we need to get some balls, man. We need to call out the racists for what they are and say, the university is not a place for racists. Go do your bullshit someplace else. If you're here to constantly racialize yourself and racialize your students, you need to find another job. Your students do not exist for you to racialize them. They do not exist for you to indoctrinate them. You are not here to racialize yourself. You're here to do research. You're not here to indoctrinate your students. You're here to engage in an educational relationship with your students and to participate in their moral and ethical formation, which, by the way, you are not supposed to direct. You're just supposed to facilitate. You're not supposed to control. You're just supposed to facilitate. All right. I got that off my chest. Maybe I'll break that down a little further in the future. I am one day going to do a Zoom share and go through a bunch of documents that were produced at the university. The time isn't right yet, but I am going to bring some more evidence in this. So That's it for today. Let's get the racists out of the university. Let's kick them out. Let's totally kick them out. It's time. All right. David's signing off.